Welcome to this episode of Keeping Her Keys. This conversation is hot off the presses, like they say. We recorded this yesterday. It's a really, really candid conversation about the two keys to my teaching and writing, which are psychology and witchcraft. We cover so many topics, from trying to define psychology and witchcraft to our personal experiences. We discuss how people can be marginalized by mainstream healthcare, the problems with calling things self help. And then we land on a discussion about the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder as a kind of case study about how we can be mislabeled and mistreated in the mainstream world. It's a deep conversation, my witches. Enjoy it. Get your candle ready. Get your notebook ready if you want. We decided that we're going to be doing a second part that we'll record in a few weeks. So this is just the beginning of the conversation. I love getting your feedback about episodes. So as always, send me an email, and hail Hecate. Hello, and welcome to our conversation about something that is really central to my own healing journey and also my teaching and writing, which is abiding at the crossroads of witchcraft and psychology. I've been wanting to do a dedicated episode exploring this for a long time, and now it seems the time has finally arrived. And I considered who I wanted to have this conversation with, if I wanted to bring in experts and so on, authors. And in the end, what I decided is that I wanted to talk with Liz and May and Christen, because they have such powerful stories of their own self-healing from abiding at the crossroads of witchcraft and psychology. We don't always need a bunch of experts in the room. We need to hear each other's stories and be in a circle together of support and understanding so that we can feel inspired and empowered. And that is our sincere wish for your experience of joining this conversation with us. We will be talking about all manner of things that can be upsetting, from anxiety to depression to trauma, chronic health conditions, navigating the health system, all of those things. If you listen to the Keeping Her Keys podcast, we go there, we talk about hard things, because by giving light to hard things, we can heal ourselves and help others find the way forward. But if you're not feeling up to this conversation, you may want to sit this one out. And without further ado, if you happen to have a candle nearby, or you can use your hands, and we'll come together and create the circle. So let's just begin with that counterclockwise circle motion, connecting to that reversing energy, the cleansing energy, letting go. And since the topic of mental health or psychological distress is still taboo in our society, let's just envision we're removing any barriers to having a really candid conversation about that. And of course, the same goes with witchcraft. This is a safe space where honesty prevails. And now let's cast the circle around, protecting us for this conversation. And you can even extend that out further as we offer protection and also connecting us to this conversation, to the passion and kindness and integrity the four of us are offering you. And of course, to our beloved Hecate, who is such a phenomenal spirit for guiding us along the self-healing journey. So for the invocation today, I chose one that we've used before quite a few times. But for me, this poem I wrote very much captures my own healing journey from, through trauma and everything else. That was very much at that crossroads of psychology and witchcraft. So this is the section in the book from Entering Hecate's Garden. The section in the book is called Soul Medicine. I was unwanted, and witchcraft was my medicine. I was left broken, and witchcraft was my medicine. I fell into the abyss, and witchcraft was my medicine. I walked through the fire, and witchcraft was my medicine. I healed, and witchcraft was my medicine. I was reborn, and witchcraft was my medicine. I stand in my power, and witchcraft is my medicine. And as we've been preparing to have this conversation, we've been talking to the other guides in Covina about our own experiences of self-healing at the crossroads of witchcraft and psychology. And I believe that psychology, whether it is self-healing through books or courses like the books and courses I write, or listening to this pod, which is always at the crossroads of the two, or if you see a therapist or another professional, I believe like part of our apothecary of self-healing as witches can be psychology. And at the same time, I know that many of us, myself included, I think Liz has stories of this, that our times when we interact with like psychology writ large and also with therapy, that we can have really negative experiences and and be called or feel that we're being called out for being broken, when things have happened to us or been done to us, or we're experiencing things that are causing distress, which is not brokenness, it's natural reactions to what's going on. And and I just want to, before we begin, I want to just say to everyone here, if you have ever been made to feel crazy, or if you have been othered by mainstream treatment approaches for distress, psychological distress, I just hope that you find healing from that. You are not crazy. And for me, in my own journey, my professional journey and my personal journey of abiding in this crossroads, professionally, I've really had criticism from both worlds, from psychology and from the witch world, about what I do. And I used to try to pick a team. Does that make sense? Like, pick a team. And it's like, well, my actual team would be psychology, because my books are rooted, founded, like the foundation are psychological theories and practices that I know work. But mainstream psychology wants less than nothing to do with me, because I write about witchcraft and the healing power of witchcraft. And at the same time, in the witch world, the occult world, the pagan world, and so on, I often get a lot of flack from certain camps that are very dogmatic and say what I do in terms of being inspired by like ancient practices and inspired by maybe traditional folk magics, that what I do is like I am violating some code that these things that are thousands or hundreds of years old, they can't evolve, they can't be contemporized, they have to stay as they were. So I remember years ago when I first started writing, someone wrote a really thoughtful comment, and they said, you abide in that sweet spot, that liminal space where you come at this as, you know, a doctor of psychology, and also as someone who has been studying contemporary, comparative religion and energetic healing for decades. And this person, they said, well, so you're in this sweet spot that is very helpful for a lot of people, and at the same time you will draw the ire of people firmly on either side. So that's been like a journey for me, just to say, I abide at this crossroads. I love this crossroads. I'm not going to pick a side. I'm going to be pulling from both areas, merging them together, and doing what I'm doing. And wherever you're at in your own self-healing journey, I hope you feel inspired to do the same. There is no one right way to heal into your own wholeness. There is no one right way to get therapy, or there's no one right personal development book. There's no one right way to practice witchcraft. But maybe we should start with a little bit of definition about kind of how we are talking about psychology and witchcraft today, just to be clear. So psychology, my PhD is in applied social psychology. My training was in attachment and close relationships, including things like social skills, coping skills, and so on. This is my foundation as a professional. So psychology is a huge, huge, huge field. There's clinical psychologists who are PhDs and doctors of psychology that are trained to be clinical psychologists. Psychiatry is a completely separate thing that has very little to do with psychology, so we should probably clear that one up. I'm not talking about psychiatry. I'm not one. We might bump into it in the conversation, but it's a completely separate thing from psychology. So there's that, and then there's all the never-ending parade of personal development books. Just like think of them like Atomic Habits, like they just never stop. There's always a new one, right? That really great book on boundaries. Like there's all these great books that come from PhDs in psychology, not written by, people who have an interest in it. Not saying they can't write good books, but I'm talking about people who are psychologists who write these type of books. There's all that never ends. It's a huge parade. So there's those two ways we can engage with psychology. So we're talking about the big wide field. We're leaving a lot of psychological areas like off the table today. Like we're not getting into neuropsych too much. Probably won't get into like psychology of the workplace or environmental psych or community psych. But we're really focused on the areas of psychology, which is the study of the mind and behavior that are related to healing. And by healing, I'm talking about self-healing that positions ourselves as basically in charge of our own healing journey, whatever that might look like for us. I really dislike the word self-help. And I prefer self-healing because I don't know, self-help always sounds to me like we're broken. Self-healing is like we're working on things. So, and then witchcraft, I think the four of us here, we practice a sort of animistic witchcraft that's natural magic centered around the goddess Hecate and her mythic companions. It also expands to other deities and spirits and so on, but it's very much a form of natural magic that is designed to be helpful for our own development and to help other people. So we do not do malefic things, which is something that really fascinated me in prepping for this, is that the Oxford English Dictionary itself is revising and has recently, as March of 2023, revised the definition of witch. So it becomes a much more neutral or benevolent definition. And psychology is also evolving rapidly too. So we're talking about two huge areas. But for those of us who have trauma or chronic health problems and identify as witches, we're going to be in that crossroads. And I think there is a way for us to bring them together, because although they are different in many regards, they also have a lot of similarities. And I think witchcraft brings depth to psychology, whether it's a personal development book or therapy, and vice versa, that psychology can be really flushed out by adding rituals and spells. And so that is what I do. And in this book, the lesson 1 in the first chapter, I start off talking about that, about personal development, and then I'm a psychologist. And that's, so this is really at the heart of my work. So that's my big spiel about what we're going to be talking about today. I just want to get right into the thick of it, because I know I've mentioned to a few people outside of the coven that we're doing this episode, and people are like, oh, I can't wait for that episode. Like, I really want to hear what y'all think about what you have to say about this and where you're going to land. So Mae, maybe we can start with you, and you can share a little bit of your personal journey at this crossroads.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had a lot of experience with psychology and counseling and things like that. I have seen a therapist off and on since I was probably 6 or 7 years old. I've had a couple of interesting experiences that were really helpful and some that were not so helpful. But I think one of the main things that I would like to talk about is something that you said touched this off in me when you were saying something about how we don't do malefic things, right? It made me think about how there are so many things in the way that some people approach witchcraft and how I've seen some people approach therapy, whereas it's those people are the problem. These other people around me are the problem. What can I do to control them? And for me, one of the most healing things has been to realize what I can control. And that's usually what goes on here, right?
Yeah.
What goes on within me and what goes on in my immediate environment and things like that. And so I was thinking about this time that it was actually pretty recently, I want to say 2015. So almost exactly 5 years ago. I was actually in an inpatient psychiatric hospital. And I was there. I had just ended my second marriage and a disastrous rebound dating experience. And I just felt so broken. Like you said, I just felt so broken. And I felt that nothing was helping me. My witchcraft didn't seem to be helping me. I didn't even know if I had the energy for it. I didn't believe that I was lovable. I didn't believe that I was worthy of love and care and affection. And so I'm glad that I had the strength to get myself some help. And so one of the first things that happened when I was there that just really changed everything for me was just how kind the staff was as they were getting me settled. And it was, and it sounds so sad to say this, but that was the most kindness that I had experienced in a while at that point. Just the kindness of, do you want your earrings back? Do you want, because I don't know if any of you have gone through this, but if you go to the emergency room for psych things, it's almost like prison. They take everything from you. They take anything that you could possibly use to harm yourself. And maybe rightfully so, but it's a very jarring experience. So just something like, do you want your earrings back so that your gauges don't shrink? Do you want, your t-shirt? Do you want, things that I wasn't allowed to have in the ER, they gave back to me right away. And that to me makes me now think of how in both witchcraft and psychology, you have to believe that there's something different that's possible, right, than what you're experiencing. And so I started thinking about all the little things that I did while I was there that I was able to control. I couldn't really leave, right? So I I realized my body wanted to move. That would make me feel better. So I paced up and down the halls and I, did yoga in my room, and I walked out to our concrete patio, which had like one planter with some plants in it. And I connected with nature that way. And we had a very robust like crafting session, that happened pretty regularly. And I realized looking back, all that wasn't really super intentional at the time, or maybe it was, and I just hadn't thought about it and made the connection so explicitly. But all the crafts I made were talismans.
Mm.
They were all with like everything I made had a purpose. Everything I made was like, a vision board, or I made like a little wooden box that said self-love on it. And I filled it with little scraps of paper that were ideas I could do to like take care of myself, whether it was like go for a walk or read a book or take a nap, things that I could do to remind myself in the moment when I was feeling really stressed out, like I could care for myself and that I deserved that care. And so I just think about how much that journey changed me, and how just like focusing on what I wanted, right? Like we do in magic. We focus on what we want versus what we don't have. And I started focusing on, okay, I came here because I felt unloved and unlovable. And so where do I already have love in my life? Like maybe I'm not partnered, maybe I will never be partnered again, but I have these friends that I'm really close to. I have, my mother is here. I have my animals that I love and who love me back. And so I just really started, practicing gratitude for those things and recognizing it. And I think if I hadn't done that, I would not have been in the place that I was, where I met my current partner, where it was like we met, and for the first time, I think ever in my adult life, I approached a relationship from the point of, I don't need to grasp at this love because I already have love.
Mhm.
This is just extra love. And I could just accept it for what it was and enjoy it and let it evolve. And it's been really great.
Wow, you said so much. First of all, I just want to like applaud you for being so brave to say what you just said. So thank you for that. It's so helpful. It's so healing, to hear your experience, because it makes us feel like, your bravery lends itself to solidarity. That like my personal mental, I've never been an inpatient, but I have been in some pretty low places that sound similar to what you experienced. And so I feel less alone. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And it's so inspiring because you found your way out and you connected to love and creativity and could see a different outcome, which, like you mentioned, is such an important part of the practice of the type of animistic witchcraft that we all practice here, that the intention, the outcome is the focus of what we're doing. So thank you. I'm taking it all in. I'm just taking it all in. That was a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot.
It was all good. And I don't want to want any of it to go by me. So I'm trying to just like absorb it. And so none of the little pieces fly by me. How are you doing today? So you said this was several years ago. How are you today?
Yeah, so I mean, this is funny because I was talking to my partner about how we were going to be doing this podcast. And, he met me. I mean, literally, we started talking almost right after I left the hospital. We just happened to meet through a mutual friend on Facebook. And he said, like I saw it in you, when I first really started getting to know you, and I believed in you, but I'm so happy to see that you have started to believe in yourself, and he said it's just been amazing to watch you just step into your power and, claim your like, how outgoing you are and your leadership skills, and to just be, so supportive to other people and mentor other people. He's like, I know that when I met you, you probably would have never saw this for yourself, like maybe hoped, but never really believed it was possible. And he's like, and it's just so amazing to see it happening. And he definitely credits Covina. He's like, it's been so amazing to watch you, go through all of that, and like just how committed you are. And he's like, I'm just so proud of you. So yeah, I mean, and even without his validation, honestly, I mean, I think about that a lot. I think about even a year ago, how different things are, like how I've been working really hard on overcoming imposter syndrome, how I've been really stepping into more roles with responsibility and commitment. And when I joined Covina, let me tell you, I was so terrified of committing to anything, right? So, and so now I maybe commit too much. So I mean, to bring that back into balance a little bit, but yeah, I mean, it's really kind of nice to look back and see that journey, right? To see all of the strides that I've made and really take ownership of that, and but also recognize the support that I've had along the way, and just that I have this container where I have like financial stability relatively. I have, a relationship that's stable. There's not a lot of arguments or, chaos in my life. Um, and that makes a big difference. I mean, those two things are really huge. I think it's really hard to work on healing yourself when you're constantly putting out fires, right? Or wondering where your next meal is coming from, or wondering where if you're going to get your water turned off. I mean, and that's kind of where I was when I was getting hospitalized. So, it's kind of a big picture thing. And that's, I think, something that's really important to recognize, is that when you have those basic needs taken care of, it's a lot easier to kind of go deeper with the psychology and the witchcraft and have that space to do so.
That's such an important point. And it reminds me of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, since we're talking about psychology and kind of the big names in psychology, that idea that if your basic needs aren't met, you can't move further up the hierarchy, in his way of thinking. You can't kind of do those things that are more about self-actualization, what he called self-actualization. I tend to say like healing into your wholeness. You can't be your most authentic and true self if you have food insecurity and residential insecurity and so on. And I don't know, like sometimes I have seen this where people are in that state because a lot of times when we are having like psychological problems, like if we are depressed or anxious, going through breakups, living with trauma and so on, because we have so much to deal with because of what was done to us, that it makes it really hard for us to be able to attend to kind of the normal things of life, like making sure we don't live beyond our means, and like, or we're in a bad situation, and we have to stay in a situation that's causing us more harm because we can't afford to leave. So it's so important to add that to like our table discussion, because that's always been one of my pet peeves when people are talking about like psychology and getting help, or even like in witchcraft and about doing certain things. It's like we can't deny like the economic and like logistical hurdles to healing that exist. It's really hard to do a meditation and a ritual and a spell if you're living with your abuser. I mean, it can be done. And then it's almost about learning where to shift your gaze and your energy. Like if, it's not about healing yourself if you're in a bad situation, it's about fixing the situation. And you said like about believing that there is an alternative, better outcome possible, which that loops back to even way back in the day when I was reading Laurie Cabot's books. And she was like, the witch's mind is the most powerful tool. And I was like, oh yes, that is psychology right there. That we can see what, we don't need to like propitiate Hecate in elaborate ways. We need to get out of this bad situation ASAP. And that needs to be where our energy goes, spiritual, magical, practical, to getting out of that bad situation. So I think that's just super important to add to the conversation. Because I've seen people who are trying to evolve, ascend, whatever you want to call it, become a chosen one of Hecate, and they're in like the shittiest living conditions. And they're not focused on that at all. So this is like, avoidance coping. That, oh, I'll just pray to Hecate and do this ritual the right way. And if I do it the right way, she'll show me favor. And because she gives me a boon, she'll solve my problems for me. And, that's definitely not like what we're talking about here today. We are talking about being empowered through the practice of witchcraft. Not, I don't even know what you would call that. To me, I always want to, because of my evangelical upbringing, we used to see it in the church all the time. Be like, just go down to the altar, give it all up to Jesus. Jesus is going to pay your water bill. Instead of being like, Jesus, help me develop the skills I need so I can pay my own damn water bill. And I think it's in this book, I said something like, Hecate can't do for us what she can't do through us. And like, to see ourselves as having like personal agency, and that your story is such a testimony to personal agency. So thank you for that. So Christen.
Yeah.
Christen, I'm just thinking about your magical life that you've created for yourself. Like you all have magical lives. And I know, because I know you all personally, I know the blood, sweat, tears, magic, deep inner work that has gone into the lives that you've created for yourselves. And so I'm just curious, Christen, if, like, whatever you want to share about your own self-healing journey at this crossroads.
So, it's funny, when you first asked me to be on this episode, I thought like, I'm not qualified. Like, I'm not qualified for this. But hopefully someone can relate. I've never been to therapy. I have no experience with like an actual psychologist. And so witchcraft and like psychological healing came together for me at the same point, like when I joined Covina 4 years ago. And I'm thinking about, what you're saying about personal agency and like learning to stand in your power. And that was like a big pivot point for me, because I think I was basically on autopilot in my life, and I didn't have the understanding or the skills to cope, or know how to cope, or know how to reach out, or who to talk to, or what to do. And so when COVID hit, and I found myself in Covina, or I found myself interested in witchcraft. Like I said, I was just trying to cope. And I don't know, I don't really know how to put this into words, but it was just so like, it's not at all what I expected, but it's exactly what I needed. This coming into your power and like healing yourself psychologically are so symbiotic. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to find the words. I'm thinking about like what you were just saying about Hecate can't do for us what she can't do through us. And I think about boundaries. Boundaries was huge for me. And I think that was probably my greatest lesson, was how to set personal boundaries so that I could heal. I had to like stop and take a good hard look inward and kind of get my life together, and like sort of get my cognitive shit together.
Yeah.
And I got sober, I quit smoking, and it's just been really, really transformative. It's also been hard. It's been a lot of work, and you call it the real work, right? I had to cut a lot of toxic relationships out of my life. Like my whole life just did like a 180. But it's just been such a powerful healing journey.
I love how you landed on boundaries, because that's something that's become so like important to my work, and also like culturally important. And when like a psychological construct mainstreams, sometimes we forget even like where that came from, or what the original research was about. The like, and a lot of this comes from different types of therapies and theories, such as like dialectical behavior therapy, so it comes, like the work on boundaries, like it didn't just fall out of the sky fully formed. You know, it grew from research, it grew from theory, it grew from therapy. So, you know,
Right.
there's this whole depth to working on boundaries, that when you do that deep work around boundaries and like know what your own personal policies are, and what you will do and what you won't do, and developing like your personal credo, that's psychological work.
Right. And then what happens within that boundary? I think about, like we have this daily ritual that involves meditation and like calming ourselves and like a self check-in, sort of like just coming into alignment, like inwardly and outwardly. Yeah.
And you touched upon relationships, and the ones that are inside our magic circle and the ones that don't have a place inside our magic circle. For me personally, and just linking back to what Mae was saying, like I used to get in these relationships, they were always a disaster. And I think in the conversation we've been having with the guides, someone even brought up, like, if the same thing keeps happening, it's probably you. And that like a health professional said that to them, which seemed really harsh at the time. But for me, it doesn't absolve people of doing nasty things, but it's like, if you keep finding yourself in these situations, like these precarious, risky situations, then there may be some deep healing that you need to do, like on yourself. Like you were saying, like just sit with yourself. Like COVID was such a great thing in that way, that it forced us to be with ourselves.
Right.
So that, and like we could feel anxious or depressed and all of those things. And one of the things that it's kind of like a pet peeve of mine is how like the cultural standard is that we need to be happy all the time. And so when you said like it's hard because it's saying to yourself, I'm not okay and it's okay. It's the end of denial, or it's the end of feeling that you're the problem. You can be broken and need help, but this is a state, and I'm in this state for reasons, and I'm not defective, and I'm not crazy. I need help, whether it's a book, a course, a therapist, whoever you go to for help, and just like seeing that from a different perspective, because it's a lie we've all been force fed, that everybody's happy. And that, like when I first started teaching at university, I was teaching like the undergraduate third year course on different like psychological disorders, which at the time, this is only 20 years ago, it's called abnormal psychology. And yet within the, if you think of that, if you've taken this course or you've seen a textbook for abnormal psych or psychopathology or clinic or intro to clinical psych, you'll see the textbooks like this, and everyone can find themselves in that book. So if everyone can find themselves in that book, how it can't be abnormal.
Right.
Like it's normal to be anxious, depressed. And then we were talking a little bit just before we turned on the recording about about ADHD. And Liz, I think it was you that made someone made the good point that in our society, to get a diagnosis means that you get access to treatment. And you have an interesting perspective. So we have Mae, who's had a lot of experience with therapy, Christen, who's done a lot of like self-healing, personal development work, but no therapy, and Liz, who used to work with psychologists and psychiatrists and also her degree is in philosophy. So Liz is really helping us flesh out this circle a bit. And you said some interesting things just based on your years that you used to work. Did you work with psychologists and psychiatrists?
Yes, I worked in both inpatient services and outpatient services. So when Mae was talking about how they treat you in the emergency room. Like I was on the other, so I wasn't in the emergency room, but I was in the psychiatry department, like admitting the people. But I was 19 and I had no training. And they, and so a lot of my trauma actually comes from the work I did with psychiatrists and with psychologists, because, I was really put in a position where I'm hearing kind of every patient at their worst possible point in their life, right? Like if you're coming into inpatient, something pretty bad is happening to you. And I had no training to help me deal with hearing everyone else's trauma over and over again, and so for me, like when we started talking about this yesterday, I was like, well, I don't really think about what I do for witchcraft in terms of psychiatry and psychology. And I realized it's because I just want to reflexively like avoid that topic, because that's where my trauma is. Like it's workplace trauma, but it's workplace trauma from, that people in that profession. And I think, many people may not have workplace trauma in relationship to psychiatry and psychology, but they may have had like a bad relationship with a therapist or a bad relationship with something else in that mental health system, and may also shy away from thinking about what they're doing in terms of psychiatry or psychology with witchcraft. But for me, like I think my version of witchcraft is inherently psychological, because it requires us to think about ourselves and to work on ourselves and to set those intentions and to have good boundaries. Hail Christen and her good boundaries. Because if you can't do those things, then you don't have the strong foundation to stand on to do the ritual or the spell or the work or whatever it is. So yeah, it's a unique set of circumstances that I think brought me to where I am. But honestly, working with you has been a version of therapy for me, because I didn't ever want to have anything to do with anybody who ever even came close to psychiatry, psychology again, because it was such a novel experience. So I love you as a person, and I also love you for my tolerance therapy that you've
Right. Exposure therapy.
My exposure therapy over the years.
Not all psychologists are terrifying.
No, many of them are very lovely people.
I have known many who are terrifying that work in inpatients and other places. So I know the type. So I just think that was so important. And I'm glad you brought it up, because like you said, you have it from workplace trauma. And that we could do maybe we should do a whole episode on that, on workplace trauma and rituals and magic, to help us with workplace trauma. Ideas for the next season. But it's just like many witches, people who identify as witches, and all the different others that you could be, like have had really negative experiences in mainstream healthcare and in psychology and psychiatry, which is something completely separate from psychology. I'm a psychologist, I gotta say that. So just healing from that, like you said, doing a bit of exposure therapy. Not all psychologists are bad. I'm not a psychiatrist. Don't confuse me with one. I won't comment whether all psychiatrists are bad. There's good ones out there. Just talking about that, and something that we've been talking a little bit about that's kind of been a common thread running through like our discussions leading up to the recording is how different diagnoses, like they have power. Like Liz can attest to, like, because of her work experience, if you get the diagnoses, you get the treatment.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't, you don't. And something I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting, in relation to, I think it was something Mae said before we started, was we would often have patients who were basically in the mental health closet in terms of like not wanting to have their mental health diagnoses recorded anywhere. So like patients would come in, they would pay cash, they would, sign whatever forms they needed to make sure nobody could ever find out they were here. And so really when you think about the stigma of being in the witch closet or the stigma of being in the mental health care closet, those things can be traumatic either way. If you feel like you have to hide something fundamental about yourself, like that's a whole shift in the way you interact with the world, with the way you interact with others, and the way you interact with yourself.
Right, because you never feel safe. Because you're always saying like, when will the moment be that I get outed? Either someone outs me because they have information about these things that I'm keeping private, or if I goof up and out myself. So there's that double kind of stigma that can, be going on if you have like diagnoses. For me, the like clinical diagnoses, like they're clinical and they belong in that environment. And they, they get us an insurance approval for a treatment, or, they do all of those things, but they don't define like who I am as a person. Like I have celiac disease, for example, or I have chronic complex PTSD, which I don't anymore, but I did for years have a really bad bout of PTSD. And for a while they kind of consumed who I was. And then like I kind of like righted myself over time personally, where it's like, no, well, I have these things, they don't have me. And I think it's something, and like I did that episode, a solo episode on the archetype of the witch, and how like the witch is so powerful, like she can have, well, the she, they, whatever gender, that they can have us too in their grips. And both of these things can get us in their grips so that we become really small. And one of the smallest or most belittling diagnoses is borderline personality disorder. And I would like us just to talk for a few minutes about this. It's such a challenging diagnosis that gets thrown at, I've seen it professionally and personally. This is a diagnosis that gets thrown at people who have really complex trauma. There's an episode I did on attachment, so we're not going to get too much into talking about attachment, but they've had like attachment, not just crises, attachment tragedies early in their life. And they were, in a sense, broken by that or shaped by that. And then they get blamed by this diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And it's my hunch, and we were talking the other day, and I said I would love to do academic research on, they call it the comorbidity, or the co-occurrence of people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and people who are like in the witch world. We're not talking about like the new age world or, bigger worlds. We're really staying focused on who we are in this conversation. But I just think that so many people get that label slapped on them, and then there is effective treatment, dialectical behavior therapy, but there's so much stigma around getting diagnosed with BPD. And May, I was wondering like what your thoughts, because I know you and I were riffing a little bit about BPD. What are your thoughts on, maybe I should say what it is. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by things like difficulty in regulating emotions, difficulty in maintaining relationships, jobs, and so on. Sometimes a lot of falsities. At the core of BPD is a complete lack of a sense of self. You don't know who you are. So they are often chameleons, and they will fawn and adapt their personality and who they present to others based on who they want to gain the favor of. So they will become sports fans, or they will, I don't know, take up whitewater rafting, and they will change the way they talk and everything, because what happened to them so early in life truncated the natural progression of a development of a sense of self. That's what's going on in BPD. They're not mean liars who are just trying to fuck up everybody's lives. But a lot of times they kind of get portrayed as like mean liars just trying to ruin everybody else's lives. I don't know, May, what are your thoughts on BPD and witchcraft?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I'm not willing to say that BPD is not a thing. I absolutely believe it's a thing, right? But I don't like that it's characterized as a personality disorder because, like you, I really do think like a lot of these things are shaped by early childhood traumas, especially, but even like later in life traumas. And so, as somebody who also has lived with complex PTSD, as well as ADHD, I do have a diagnosis for that as well. I see so many similarities in the symptoms of all of those things, right? And especially for people who are assigned female at birth or otherwise femme, I think that BPD is a label that we get slapped with like before they dig deeper. Especially with ADHD, because our ADHD doesn't always match a lot of the research has been done on males, right? Or people assigned male at birth. And there are differences in the brain between the sexes, the biological sexes, and how things manifest at times. And so I think sometimes it's really frustrating to me to hear, about these people. Like you said, it's almost like if you have BPD, people immediately assume that you are manipulative, that you will say anything you want to get your way, that you're, sorry if you hear my dog is whining in the background. But if, that you'll say anything you want to get your way, that you're emotionally manipulative, like there's all these things. And as you were listing some of the symptoms, I'm thinking, well, I did do that when I was in abusive relationships because it was a survival mechanism. Like the chameleon thing, especially. Like, yes, I didn't get to have my own sense of self because my self was wrong. So I had to be this perfect wife or this perfect partner or this perfect step parent or whatever, in somebody else's image. I couldn't be myself. And so I think a lot about that because when I was in my second in a row abusive marriage, I've also had a traumatic brain injury. And so I went to a neuropsychiatrist for an evaluation. And, she conceded that, I probably had some residuals from the traumatic brain injury, but really the problem I had was that I was borderline personality disorder. Flash forward 2 years later, I think, or maybe 3, it was at the beginning of the pandemic. I'd been doing all of this personal work. I, had moved into a stable relationship with a stable financial job and things like that. And, so we were talking, and I had not seen this provider in the interim at all. And so I was going to get, my evaluation for ADHD because I'm like, I'm really struggling at work. Again, the quietness of the pandemic forced me to realize like I have these struggles. And so she's looking over my chart notes and she's like, I diagnosed you with borderline personality disorder. Why did I do that? And I was like, yeah, well, I was going through a lot of shit at the time. I really was. And probably what you saw was my coping mechanisms that I don't have to do anymore. And it's a real problem because studies have shown that it affects so much of people's lives. I mean, even when you go to seek medical treatment for a physical ailment, if those doctors see BPD on your chart, sometimes they'll be like, this person's malingering. This person's a hypochondriac. This person is saying whatever they want to get the drugs or to get the attention or whatever it is. And you don't get treatment on parity with people who don't have that label. So, labels can be very helpful and they can be very hurtful.
And BPD is definitely an example of that because it has that bias. I mean, even with BPD to get health insurance, because it's a high risk diagnosis for suicide and suicide attempts, that, you can be denied insurance because you have BPD. And there's all this stigma around it. And, it just, the character, like you said, we could do a whole episode talking about BPD and talking about personality disorders and what that actually means to be diagnosed with a personality disorder. But it's so meshed with the historical ways that the word witch has been used to describe, like you said, female appearing women who are manipulative, who are like Medeas or Circes, when they're spun in that negative light. And it's like the word witch has become redefined. And yet we still have this word in our society that means the same thing. And again, it's almost exclusively women who are diagnosed with BPD. And like you said, it's just you're in you end up in psychiatry and you're distressed, you're in an abusive relationship, you've got all this complex trauma, you're making poor decisions because you have no capacity to do otherwise. And instead of getting help, you're labeled with this. And instead of it being called trauma, it's called your personality is flawed, you're manipulative, you're a liar, you're seductive, you're all those things that the witch used to be seen at. Well, there's also the Hague crone aspect. But when you think of like that definition of the witch, and then it's just like, well, we just call that borderline personality disorder now. So, like there's all of this baggage around that diagnosis that I hope if anybody is with us here today for this conversation and they have that diagnosis, I just want you to know that we see you, that we understand how heavy that diagnosis is to bear. We didn't have enough time to talk about some of the other really common diagnoses, like we did touch a little bit on PTSD and ADHD, but maybe we'll talk more about them again and how those particular diagnoses can both augment and impact like any spiritual practice and how you can adapt. Because I feel like we're just starting this conversation about psychology and witchcraft, and there's so much for us to discuss. So we'll be back. If you have any questions or any specific areas of psychology and witchcraft and that crossroads of the two that you would like us to talk about in a future episode, just send an email to Hecate's Help Desk at info@keepingherkeys.com. And we hope that on your self-healing journey, you find that sweet spot where you can abide in the comfort of knowing that you were designed to be a liminal creature. Like as witches, we are liminal beings and we live in the crossroads. And to find comfort in never quite fitting in anywhere except the crossroads, I hope you find that. So thanks so much for hanging out with us for a bit. And we'll see you again real soon. The Keeping Her Keys podcast is produced and hosted by me, Cindy Brannon. I'm a witch and psychologist living in coastal Nova Scotia, Canada. I've written several books about Hecate, and also my very first book that's more of an introduction to awakening the witch within. That one's called True Magic. My frequent guests on the show are guides from my school known as Covina, the Coven of Hecate. You'll be listening to them on different episodes, and they are just an amazing group of witches that I am so happy to have in the circle of making this podcast a reality. Episodes usually explore something connected to the goddess Hecate. I became fascinated with the goddess Hecate so long ago. I do deep dives with different partners on goddesses and aspects of Hecate. Sometimes I do more psychospiritual episodes where I talk about constructs and how they intersect with the practice of natural magic. And frequently, you'll find meditations. If you're interested in learning more about my work, just go to keepingherkeys.com. You'll find out more about my books, more about Hecate, and how you can join Covina, the Coven of Hecate. If you enjoy this podcast, be sure to follow it. I usually release new episodes every Thursday. And I would absolutely love it if you could rate and review the podcast. It is so, so helpful. If you have any questions or ideas for future shows, you can send them to info@keepingherkeys.com. Thanks so much for listening, and hail Hecate.